To paraphrase Joe Biden, and you'll hear it better in his own words in a moment, one's a communist, the other is not. Still, can these rivals together get a handle on a world of growing conflicts? The U.S. and Chinese presidents meeting for the first time in more than a year to stabilize their own downgraded relations at a time when superpowers are feeling the pull factor of major wars, first in Ukraine, now the Middle East. Add to that their own standoffs in the Pacific over Taiwan and the South China Sea. Now that they've sat down in San Francisco on the sidelines of an APEC summit, we'll ask whether fellow Asia-Pacific leaders feel reassured by what they've heard from Biden and Xi Jinping, rivals but also trade partners who head the world's two powerful economies. None of the summit's participants are rooting for more confrontation. The world's polarized enough as it is. In fact, why that persistent volatility? Why do global tensions feel like they're at their highest in recent memory? We'll put it to our panel today in the France 24 debate. Can they go beyond the bare minimum? With us from New York, former White House Deputy National Security Advisor Carolyn Atkinson, Senior Global Strategist at policy consultants Rock Creek. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
From Oslo, Sunny Kapoor, Professor of Climate, Geoeconomics and Finance at the European University Institute in Florence. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
From New Delhi, Aravind Yellary, Associate Professor at the Center for East Asian Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University, the author of China, Inc. Between State Capitalism and Economic Statescraft. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
And with us here in the studio, Jean-Baptiste Bonnier, Vice President of the Asia Center think tank. Welcome back, sir.
Thanks, Francois.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation you have on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Analysts say there was a low bar to clear after last year's spy balloon incident sent U.S.-China relations to a new low, after the U.S. more recently, in August, imposed restrictions on sharing technology, after all the tensions we've seen over Taiwan that still continue. Still, they did it. They sat down, and that's despite Biden again, after the meeting, branding Xi a dictator. Shirley Sitbon has more.
The images and statements that came out of the Xi-Biden summit outside San Francisco, like this handshake, were all about improving ties between the world's biggest economies after years of tension, ranging from the flyover of the U.S. by alleged Chinese spy balloons and the status of Taiwan.
For two large countries like China and the United States, turning their backs on each other is not an option. It is unrealistic for one side to remodel the other, and conflict and confrontation has unbearable consequences for both sides.
In an effort to relieve tension, the superpowers agreed to resume military communications that had been severed by Beijing.
To keep the lines of communication open, including between President Xi and me. He and I agreed that each one of us could pick up the phone, call directly, and would be heard immediately.
Among other key issues, the two leaders have agreed on illicit fentanyl, the drug that kills tens of thousands of people every year in the U.S. China says it will target companies producing the chemicals which drug cartels use to make the deadly opioid. Although their goal was to smoothen their ties, President Biden did not mince words regarding President Xi's governing methods.
Well, look, he is. I mean, he's a dictator in the sense that he is a guy who runs a country that is a communist country that's based on a form of government totally different than ours.
The most sensitive issue, though, was Taiwan. A U.S. official said that Biden chided China over its massive military buildup around the island, and Xi telling Biden he had no plans to invade Taiwan. According to Chinese media, Xi urged the U.S. to support China's peaceful unification with the self-governed island, calling Taiwan the most important and most sensitive issue.
Carolyn Atkinson, let's talk messaging here. Second time that Joe Biden has called Xi Jinping a dictator. Now, Biden's an old Cold Warrior. Is this a planned strategy, or did he shoot from the hip?
It's not a planned strategy. And if you watch more of it, you can see that the reporters were sort of pushing him to come up with those words. Now, I think it's unfortunate that he did. He sort of couched it, as we saw, in a longer sentence about in the sense that this form of government. So I don't think he meant to poke at Xi in that way. I think what will matter going forward is how it's portrayed in China. Because last time President Biden mentioned that Xi called him a dictator, anger was whipped up in China by Chinese state media and so on. In the run-up to this summit, there has been a lot of good press in China about, friendship ties and win-win solutions. And so I think if China can sort of move past the word itself and not make a big sort of fuss of it, that unfortunate wording maybe won't destroy the obvious goodwill, and we're seeing the smiling faces and good handshakes. And I think that's definitely what President Biden wanted, the impression he wanted to leave.
Well, I think we might have part of the answer for you, Caroline, at least in the short term. France 24 producer Anne Mickey was looking at Weibo earlier, and the word dictator had been expunged. It was nowhere to be found. But we did get an official reaction. Let's listen to it. Last time, as you say, there was furor in Beijing. This time, the reaction perhaps sounds more measured. Let's listen.
Such remark is extremely wrong and is irresponsible political manipulation. China firmly objects to this. It needs to be pointed out that there have always been people with ill intentions who try to sow discord and undermine China-US relations. This will not succeed.
She talks about political manipulation. Does she mean the journalists manipulated Joe Biden, or Joe Biden himself did the political manipulation?
Well, it sounds to me as if they're willing to give President Biden the benefit of the doubt that he was not intending, he did not go out with the intention of labeling President Xi that way, and they understand that. And both sides in this summit really wanted to send a good message for different reasons. And I agree with your comment that it was a very low bar. It was unfortunate that this came out, but I'm very pleased to hear that it was expunged from Chinese media. Not that I'm pleased that there's such control over the media, but I'm glad that there was a decision to downplay rather than play up that part of the press conference.
Arvin Yellery, do you agree that this is Joe Biden perhaps misspeaking, or was this kind of planned?
Well, in China, they're interpreting it very differently. They're saying it that because the upcoming elections, and then Biden losing the support, public support back in US. So China is reading that this has to do something with the domestic politics in the United States. And I think they are giving a benefit of doubt to Joe Biden. But certainly this is not the only part of the story. Largely in Beijing and other part of the country, this has been taken as a shock because APEC was seen as one of the major events, and Chinese were looking forward to break some kind of ice and get going along with the Americans. This is a difficult time for China. They're looking for some way out to work with the Americans. They want to settle the trade ties and move forward. And this has been a difficult year for the China. And they were looking up to the APEC conference, and they somehow have a mixed reactions, confusion, as well as giving him a benefit of doubt of the domestic politics of the United States.
All right, Exhibit B, which kind of corroborates what you just said. As we said, no mention of the word dictator on Weibo earlier when we checked. Pushed instead the U.S. president's admiration for his Chinese counterparts' Hongqi red flag sedan when they left the meeting.
It's a beautiful vehicle. I also changed views on a range of Oh, it's like that Cadillac we have over there.
就好像我的那个凯迪拉克一样。
International meetings, they fly those with me. You know what they call that car?
但每一次我到外面去，这车都跟着我。你知道它叫什么吗？
They call it the Beast.
野兽。
Thank you.
Top trending it was on Weibo, this little clip to see the U.S. President Jean-Baptiste Monnier praising the Chinese president's car.
Well, that's nice. Of course, they have a relationship, and despite the dictator D word that was pronounced earlier this year in a fundraising event, so Biden can't hide it. But there is a relationship. And by the way, in an interview a few months ago, Biden was asked, hey, what about your good friend Xi Jinping? And he answered, no, he's not my good friend. We know each other for many years, but this is about business. And so he's putting a bit of a distance between him and
And do you agree with Aravind that going into that meeting, Xi Jinping was the one with the weaker hand?
I do think that both of them have weak hands. I mean, internationally, that's perhaps even-handed, but internally, yes, Xi Jinping is not having a good year. He lost 2 of his secretaries in his cabinet, and there is all kinds of explanations as to what happened. That's his 3rd trip this year, only internationally. He went to South Africa for the BRICS meeting. Then he went to Russia to see his good friend in this case, because they've met 40 times, Vladimir Putin. And that's his 3rd trip. So it takes a lot to get him to move out. And perhaps there must be some reasons and some problems at home for him to stay there.
Aravind Yellery, just on that very point, how's it playing where you are in New Delhi, the fact that the Chinese president goes to San Francisco but did not attend the G20 summit hosted in the Indian capital back in September?
Well, I mean, looking at how China is playing out its positioning in APEC, China is fighting a lot of problems and complexities in Asia Pacific. It is losing a lot of ground and traction in Southeast Asia. It is losing a lot of support in East Asia also. The China is looking for more pie or more share in the rising, or changing geopolitical landscape. In India, we see that it's quite interesting. We thought that Xi Jinping will be pretty strong, but it looks like in the first reading, he went with a lot softer hand. He wanted to do a lot of soft diplomacy because he wanted to get the Americans on the table to speak, because he cannot play hard to get the Americans convincing, because if you look overall, Americans hold an upper hand in trade, in investments. A lot of things the Chinese cannot stop buying from America, and as a result of it, Chinese were a little softer. We see that Chinese were a lot softer in APEC than what should have been otherwise.
Sunny Kapoor, do you agree that again, it's this idea that China's luster has gone down, and he has to come cap in hand to summits like this one and meet with Joe Biden, which he didn't have to do in the past necessarily?
I wouldn't use that phrase at all. And let's just take a small step back and look at it from a global perspective. A situation where 2 of the world's biggest economic and military superpowers, and it's sometimes been called a G2 world, and understandably so, are not on talking terms, is a dangerous world for everyone. Big country, small country, India, the EU, the global South, what have you. And I think, this was without any caveats, a long overdue, very welcome step that they are on talking terms again, and that the tone of the meeting was relatively benign. And you are right about sort of low expectations. This is a time when these 2 superpowers should be cooperating on bringing about an end to the conflicts raging tackling climate change, helping boost the global economy. And, none of that is happening, right? I mean, but at the very least, they're talking. And there seems to have been some sort of a thawing of the ice. And perhaps, I wouldn't be surprised if this led to, a monthly or a quarterly sort of call between Biden and President Xi to follow up on specific issues. And again, this is something that is good for everybody, not just good for the United States, not just good for China, domestically and internationally, but really a very least minimum thing that that needed to be done. In the kindergarten that I went to in Delhi, you have sort of a custom. It's called Kutti and Abba. And Kutti means I'm not on talking terms with you. And Abba is, okay, well, let's talk again, right? So this is, it's unacceptable that the two largest superpowers are on Kutti, but at least they've decided they are willing to talk. And that's something that's unambiguously good for everybody.
Summits to try and reassure are nothing new. Back in June of 2021, the U.S. and Russian presidents traveled to Geneva for a meeting to stave off escalating tensions over Ukraine. We know how that went. Let me ask you, Sunny Kapoor, when you think back to the world of 2021 and you look at the world of 2023, in this particular bilateral meeting, summit, whatever you want to call it, how much has the world changed and how different is this meeting?
Well, I think the meeting is very different, right? I mean, no one in their right mind, back then or now, thought that Russia and United States were near equal powers. On nuclear warhead count, perhaps, that's probably the only parameter where Russia and the United States are sort of relative equals. On everything else, the only country that comes relatively close to where the United States is, and in some cases exceeds its power, is China. So that was not a meeting of equals. That was not a meeting of a relationship of equals. It was a power in steep decline, with its sort of back against the wall, doing a last hurrah. And the relationship of mistrust between Russia and the United States, and in particular Putin and the United States, had sort of a long history. And in the beginning, with when President Xi and when Biden were vice presidents, they had a reasonably good working relationship, as did Biden and the Chinese administration. As did Obama and the Chinese administration back then, right? So the mistrust and the breakdown of relationship with China is far more recent, and I think it is a much more shallow wound that is not going to, hopefully, end up anywhere close to how sharply the U.S. and Russian relationship deteriorated after Russia invaded Ukraine. So in short order, I do not think that a year or 2 years from now, we'll be looking back at this summit and saying, oh, look, now that China has invaded Taiwan, how the world has changed. I don't think that's going to happen. I hope that the bottom of the relationship and the deterioration has now been reached, and we now desperately need a slow climb up into a constructive working order.
Of course, back then, China was under a zero COVID policy. Jean-Baptiste Monnier, I heard you quip earlier about the number of times Xi Jinping has met Vladimir Putin. We all remember Putin traveling to Beijing at the opening games of the Winter Olympics just before he invaded Ukraine. It was seen as China siding with or giving its blessing to what ensued. Today, do you think China views that triangle between Russia and the United States the same way as it did?
I think so. I don't think they've changed their position. By the way, when you have enemies, I mean, I don't think Russia is a real partner for China. I mean, they've had their histories, and so having your neighbor that you keep at bay fight with your other opponents, that's not bad. But the timing is interesting. You mentioned this Geneva conference in July, and agree with Sony. It was a different tone at the time when Biden met Putin.
In 2021,
yeah. 2021. It was 8 months before the Ukraine invasion, and so this is scary regarding the event today, the meeting today we had. But when you look back, the tension was, you could feel it. They didn't have a joint press conference.
And you don't feel that tension with Taiwan?
I feel the tension with Taiwan. I don't feel that much tension between Xi Jinping and Joe Biden, I should say. Just that. On the press conference, which were separated, Biden actually was called by a journalist on the way out, and I think the journalist said, "Why do you think you're confident about Putin changing his behavior?" I didn't say that, says Biden. And what the hell do you tell me that? I mean, these guys don't know. So, and then he apologized to the journalist, but there was tension in the air. That was obvious, and we know where that ended. So I hope that, as Sonia mentioned, I hope that these two superpowers get into a talking mode, a talking process going forward. At least that's the bottom we can hope, and the low bar you were talking about.
Yeah, and just on the Putin comparison, Biden, when he was vice president, was very upset about Russia's moves then against Ukraine, them taking Crimea, and he was extremely upset with Putin and would have favored a stronger response then from the United States. So I think that he has had very deep suspicions with Putin, as Jean-Monnet says, and whereas he's had a sort of relationship of eating noodles and now admiring the cars, which is more of a kind of personal warmth, it doesn't mean that everything's fine or hunky-dory, as you say in America, between the two big leaders. But I think it's different from the tensions that there were with Vladimir Putin.
It's perhaps different, but the world seems like a more volatile place. Gaza is a long way from the Pacific Ocean, but that didn't stop pro-Palestinian protesters from joining the fray in San Francisco to make their views heard by the U.S. president. Caroline Atkinson, you know, this is the question that people ask us a lot of times as journalists. Why is the world so much more volatile than it was? Ukraine, now the Middle East. Could it be Taiwan? What's going on?
I think that's a great question. And actually, I would bring it back also to our domestic politics. Certainly in the United States, there has been more violence, more anger, more division in recent years than was traditional. And we see that actually playing out on the floor of Parliament, our Congress. There was almost a sort of fist fight recently. And Congress has found it very hard to reach any agreements. We all observed and lived through the Trump presidency, and now that former president, despite facing a lot of indictments, is pretty much even with Biden in the polls. I still don't think he will win, but it's a real danger. So our domestic politics, I think, certainly in the United States, I think also in many other countries, and you just showed what was happening in Spain, have got more divisive. Now, why that is, I think maybe there's a hangover from the global financial crisis. There is uncertainty about what is the post-globalized, post-Cold War, post-Cold War sphere of power and influence. And then, quite honestly, I think the pandemic just made everybody more tense, more irritated, and more irritable. Not to say there aren't real structural problems between Israel and Palestine, but the way that has flared up inside other countries, and as you showed in America, it has taken people aback, I think.
Why is that? What's the link between the pandemic and Ukraine, the South China Sea, the Middle East?
Well, maybe this sounds too soft or something, but I do think people got upset during the pandemic and frightened. And then that was followed by inflation in many countries, many of the richer countries. So there's a sort of sour mood amongst consumers and voters. And that sort of spills into politics. There has also, I mentioned former President Trump. He obviously wants to foment disagreement and divisiveness. So does Vladimir Putin. he's happier if there is this division in the West. I mean, I want to put on the good side on those balance scales. Yes, Ukraine is really difficult, but actually the West became stronger and became closer together in the wake of the initial invasion. I think we're now at a very tricky time with Ukraine not making much progress in its counteroffensive and uncertainty in the United States about continued support. But the West got strengthened in a way that I think Russia did not expect. I doubt whether Putin expected there to be this sort of beginning of a rapprochement between America and America's president and President Xi Jinping. I think that's still a very tricky area. The sort of economic and trade ties are not getting built up again. But it is a relief to hear the president say that he can pick up the phone and ring President Xi, because in the experience, I'm sure you and your viewers maybe know, but at the time of the so-called red balloon, it was impossible for the United States to reach anybody for more than 24 hours in China who could say, yes, this is an aggressive act, or no, it's a mistake, or so that kind of inability to connect is scary.
Sunny Kapoor, again, if we trace back to the pandemic, back then, politicians throughout Europe and in the United States came to the stark realization that, well, their economies were very dependent on China. And they talked about, now the polite expression is de-risking, not decoupling. Still, this idea that there has to be a move away. All the talk we saw in August with the United States, tightening restrictions on sensitive technologies traded with China. Again, that's also, I guess you could call it, an after effect of the pandemic to a degree as the world becomes more digitalized. Does this make now it harder for any kind of thaw?
I think just taking on some of the earlier points made and adding the question you asked, there is definitely a hangover from the global financial crisis. And one way of thinking about it is, if you remember, peak Euro crisis, there was a narrative of Spanish exceptionalism. And the story was that Spain had seen about 2 million immigrants coming in from often Ecuador and Latin America, North Africa in the run-up to the GFC, and was the economy that suffered maybe second or third worst after, I think, Greece and Ireland in the crisis, had unemployment rates of 25%. And yet there was no far-right Spanish party. There was no anti-immigrant marches. And the narrative was that was because Spain, like Portugal, had a living memory of dictatorship. The ghost of Franco loomed large. Look at Spain now, setting aside the recent decision on Catalonia. But before this, Spain now has 3 far-right parties, right? And the link there, I think, is quite clear now, which is, as human beings, it's relatively easy to be open and liberal and sharing and, progressive if your instinct is that tomorrow is going to be better than today. If you think your expectation is your children are going to have a better future than you, right? If the size of the pie is expanding, it's not that hard to be generous and welcoming. And what has been quite shocking, I think, across the world is how very relatively nasty we turn, how our brain switches mode into one of talking about my share of the pie. The minute the pie starts stagnating or shrinking, the minute tomorrow doesn't look so rosy and promising, the minute you feel insecure about your children's future. And I think, that hangover has not gone away. There have been bits and pieces, years of some growth. The US has seen some fast growth. But that economic insecurity and a lower expectation about a poorer future has not gone away. And that is one of the things that has contributed significantly to polarization domestically in countries, a loss of trust in institutions, and also making it much harder to strike deals that are win-win across borders.
But on that point, Sonny, on that point, you heard because we've talked in the past about how the Pax Americana may be over, a splintering of the pull and the size of the big superpowers, that powers distributed more around the globe. But she was saying a minute ago, Caroline, how you saw the situation since Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Perhaps America has been bolstered.
Well, I do think that America has been.
I'm sorry, I was just putting it to Sonny Kapoor.
Yes and no, right? So domestically, America had sort of a step change after President Trump was booted out of office. And that led, in a way, I mean, if you remember a few years before that, Norway, where I live now, decided to award a Nobel Peace Prize to President Obama just because he was President Obama, not because of anything he had done, because it was seen to be a significant, friendlier tone, making up with allies, less aggressive, more principle-based foreign policy after the George Bush era, right? And something similar happened after Trump was booted out of office and President Biden, a more normal president, came in. And that, I think, contributed a lot to the seeming, increase in American reputation. And of course, Ukraine forced people's hands, and it was not easy. There was a clear imminent warning of an imminent invasion. It was not taken seriously by a number of European economies. And it wasn't until the Russian armies had crossed into Ukraine that the hands of NATO allies, the EU, the near neighborhood countries around Ukraine, and particularly Central Eastern European countries that still felt the Russian bear breathing down their neck, that forced the hand. So, and that alliance itself, in not so long a time, right? I mean, it's only been a year and a half, is already straining quite hard. And the shadow, the very dark, dangerous shadow of a potential Trump presidency, the idea that he's still in contention, the idea that he actually was leading on some polls today, is something that is giving everybody a massive panic attack, as it should, because he has said he would make peace with Russia, stop aid to Ukraine, and he's God knows what he's going to do with China. So there is this temporary restoration of American reputation may just be a temporary one, as long as President Trump does not clearly go out of the picture, either by being indicted and imprisoned or by someone else taking on the Republican candidacy.
Jean-Baptiste Monnier, how do the Chinese then view this?
Oh my, of course they view what they're being served. And in a regime like China, you've been served what the party wants you to hear. Everything is controlled. So I don't think the risk is coming from the Chinese people themselves. The risk is more of a governance issue. When we look down 2024, we have governance issues in Russia. We know about that. We have governance issues in the US. Sony just mentioned that, if Trump comes back. And we have governance issues in China, as you say. And the risks are any balloon can fly over the Taiwan Strait will be a disaster or a war. And now you have a president in China who is literally saying that, yes, well, there's an election in Taiwan in January 2024, but if it doesn't go his way, he's going to take action, and that could be military. It could also be a strike in the Philippines, in the disputed islands now, which could be transforming into a conflict, a regional conflict. So I think the thawing is that the communications are needed. Are they going to be enough? We'll have to see.
Arvin Yellery, let me ask you, your students, do they express this anxiety that we're describing over a splintered world and a more volatile one?
Yeah, I would rather use the word the optics that China looks at US. We were mentioning about Geneva. We were mentioning about relationship between Russia and US, I would say that they have been through time-tested strategic competitions. But when it comes to US and China, China's optics at the way it looks at US is very fluid. Uh, US stand in recent times with regard to the ethnic minorities, specifically speaking about Tibet, and then US stand over Taiwan has been very strong. And I think that is the one thing which is disturbing, for China, because, it is one of the core principles of China's foreign policy making and governance. China would not in any case compromise on these issues. So looking at these things, China has developed deep anxiety. They have developed these deep, inequalities with regard to the relationship with the United States, and that is going to stoke more volatilities in East Asia, in Asia Pacific. Asia Pacific is going to change tremendously. In last 1 year, if you talk in relative terms, the relationship between US and Russia might have been looking, more or less different than a degree. But, if you look at the relationship between US and China, that has changed tremendously. There is more uncertainty. There is more, no confidence going on there. But yes.
And on this
like
point,
APEC,
Aravind, is the establishment, as was announced, of this hotline, like they had it during the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States, this hotline between Washington and Beijing, is that symbolic or is it important?
No, I think that is all symbolic because it's only the direction, but that's not going to, you cannot conclude whether that is really going to prove to change something, but that hotline is quite important because, if you look at China's stand towards Taiwan, the way it is moving closer to Taiwan, maybe, the marine blockades or air blockades, there is a need to have this kind of hotline because never know how things are going to change. Especially, last year, August, when Pelosi was in Taiwan, the things were unpredictable. And it was so unpredictable that one of the Taiwanese, the political party like KMT had to intervene and to score some kind of brownie points and telling Taiwanese that, because of us, we could escalate the problem. So this is going to be certainly a directional change. This is certainly important when having such direct communications are concerned. But I don't think fundamentally that is going to bring immediate change. We have to just wait and see.
Especially in the run-up to elections in Taiwan. There was no formal dinner on Wednesday between Joe Biden and Xi Jinping. Instead, a banquet with CEOs, China coming off an unprecedented drop in foreign investment. And business leaders have been spooked by July's introduction of new laws in China on espionage and foreign relations that makes it easier, they say, to muscle in on their activity.
China, in terms of its predictability, it used to be very clear that China was predictable. During COVID, everybody's sort of confidence was shaken about not knowing what's going to happen next week if China changes its rules. That's happened.
Caroline Atkinson, you talked about U.S. politics being more volatile. Does the same hold true for China?
Well, I don't think the political leadership is volatile. I think she is there, and she is there for the foreseeable future. We have had these disturbances. He had these disturbances, as was mentioned earlier, with cabinet secretaries kind of disappearing. And it's a little unclear whether that ends up being a picture of strength or weakness for Xi himself. I think what is volatile is China's attitude towards foreign investment and foreign economic ties. And China's economy this year has been disappointing. The recovery was disappointing. And that's partly because Chinese consumers were not spending in the way that everybody had hoped, and certainly not spending in the way that American consumers spent once the COVID restrictions were lifted. And that's partly because of internal problems in China to do with their property sector being very weak and so on. But it's also to do with, it's not a good sign if your domestic consumers are not confident. And then on top of that, I think President Xi, I don't think he really believes in the value of strong economic ties between countries and the value of foreign investment, except to the extent that it allows China to do technology transfer, which is a polite way of saying stealing the technology that is brought from other countries. And I think that American business leaders have really become, certainly American, maybe other nationalities have become very nervous about the predictability or lack of predictability for their investments and their, in some cases, even their own personal safety inside China. And I think that will have a long-lasting effect, actually.
Jean-Baptiste Monnier, we've had a lot of talk about companies moving. Companies like, what is it, Tesla and Apple's provider Foxconn trying to set up instead factories in India. Is the world economy being reorganized, or is that being overplayed? I mean, at this
no, it is.
time.
It is. China is not investable.
Or is it just a soft landing on the part of the Chinese? You know, the population.
It's worse than that. I think there is a policy from Xi Jinping that goes against private business, private enterprise inside of China. All the investors are on strike. They're doing buybacks. They're not really investing for the future. They are cutting internet, so they're closing themselves off the world. They do that from time to time in China. France 24 is not available in China as we speak today. Their visas are not, their passports are not given. There's no tourists in New York or in Paris. Business people are being held back. And so, no, I think there's a strong direction. They want to be self-sufficient. That's China 2025. They want to do everything themselves, but it's really hard to do. So they will pay the price, but that's a change in the social contract of the prior administrations in China where, hey, we take care of your future, your wealth will be better, but we keep the power. And that's not working anymore because people have lost their savings. They don't have retirement. They don't have Social Security. They don't have employment. So they save 50% of their earnings. And most of it is in real estate. It's gone down. They've lost most of it. And the rest is in stocks, and that's also down. So the sentiment is pretty bad, but that's a price that Xi Jinping is willing to pay.
And it could be a blip. I mean, it could be short term, right?
I don't think so. No, that's really an ideology.
Now, there's wars, there's domestic strife, there's man-made disasters as well. Perhaps overlooked in the meeting between Xi and Biden is ahead of time they issued a pledge by the world's two biggest polluters, one in which they stated that both countries agreed to pursue efforts to triple renewable energy capacity globally by the year 2030. That announcement coming out, of course, Sunny Kapoor, they haven't said, it's light on specifics when it comes to closing down fossil fuels. Nonetheless, this comes ahead of the big UN climate summit, which is later this month. Is this perhaps where we're going to be able to see whether or not the US and China are ready to cooperate on issues that concern the entire planet?
Well, there's a history in that. So one of the reasons the big sort of Copenhagen COP meeting and climate change collapsed was because of the breakdown of communication between China and the United States. One of the reasons the Paris summit of 2015 was successful was because there was sort of a backroom deal agreement between China and the United States. So in that narrow sense, this is a good sign that they already, before the two presidents met, had managed to hatch out, what on a very poor baseline expected from this COP was progress, right? I mean, it's still nothing close to what is required to keep the world under 2 degrees, leave alone 1.5 degrees. 1.5 degree target, I think, is now thermodynamically, politically, and financially impossible.
Still, it's an ambitious goal, tripling renewable energy capacity globally by 2030. That's tomorrow, basically.
Well, the formal target that they're supposed to have sort of set themselves is to have reduced emissions by 2030 by around 45-50%. And instead, according to the UN, the baseline expectation is that emissions in 2030 will be 7% higher, right? So in that context, because what matters for climate change is not how much renewable energy capacity you have set up, but how much carbon dioxide and methane and other greenhouse gases you're putting into the atmosphere. And on that baseline, so yes, it's very ambitious, but compared to, what has been accomplished recently, and particularly given the two big powers, the two biggest emitters have an agreement, but it's very unambitious given the task at hand and given what needs to be done. Both of these are true.
All right, we'll leave it there for now. Much more to talk about on this topic in the build-up to the next UN Climate Summit. Sunny Kapoor, I want to thank you so much for joining us from Oslo. I want to thank Carolyn Atkinson for being with us from New York City, Aravind Yellery in New Delhi, Jean-Baptiste Monnier, thank you for being with us here in the France 24 News.